I just, I read about satellite technology, and it seemed like a good idea to broadcast to the whole continent from the satellite. I just, gave it a shot, gave it a try. We got a permit from the government. I asked them. They said it was okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I had nothing to lose,
Give it a shot.
I don't think it was a big risk. I said, well, you took a big risk. I didn't think it was a big risk at all.
Yeah.
All they could do is we could go back, like, remember in Cinderella, at midnight, the coach turned back into Pumpkin. All I would have done, if it hadn't worked, it would have gone off the satellite, and I went back to my little Atlanta station.
On October 1st, 1975, an event took place that changed everything. 8,500 miles from the media capital of the world, New York City, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier faced off for their third and final fight. This one was for all the marbles, coming live from the Philippines in a legendary fight forever known as the Thrilla in Manila. That night, the stakes were higher than ever, not just in the ring, but also for home box office, also known as HBO, an ambitious cable startup who had bet its future on expensive, game-changing satellite technology to broadcast the fight live to its American subscribers. Meanwhile, the three broadcast networks had to wait days for videotapes of the fight to make their way back to the United States. If ever there were a moment for the cable industry to announce loud and clear that the revolution would be televised live from anywhere in the world, this was it. As the fight began in Manila, a group of HBO executives, cable operators, journalists, and even members of Congress gathered halfway around the world at a Holiday Inn in Vero Beach, Florida, to watch the fight live. HBO President Jerry Levin described the moment in James Andrew Miller's book, Tinderbox, quote, "The picture quality was perfect, the fight was spectacular, and there were no technical issues. Our audience wasn't huge, but it was a meaningful number for us at the time, and we got a lot of press attention. After Thrilla in Manila, I wasn't the crazy guy anymore," end quote. Let's rewind to 30 years before HBO brought the Thrilla in Manila live to American subscribers, when British science fiction author and theoretical scientist Arthur C. Clarke had his own bold idea, one that, like Jerry Levin's, many dismissed as crazy. In October 1945, Clarke published an article in Wireless World outlining his idea of a synchronous satellite, one that would orbit in sync with Earth's rotation, where it would appear to hover in a fixed spot. This satellite could broadcast directly to homes and businesses without cables or bad reception, serving an entire continent with just simple satellite dishes below. But Clarke's idea wasn't some pie-in-the-sky science fiction like flying cars or hyperspeed travel. No, it was grounded in physics and math, complete with detailed illustrations showing that this satellite future wasn't just possible, it was coming much sooner than anyone expected. 14 years later, in the September 1959 issue of Holiday magazine, Clarke doubled down on the satellite's potential with the bold phrase, "How to conquer the world without anyone noticing." Of course, by then, his vision was no longer science fiction, it was science fact. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite into space, Sputnik. The Soviets launched Sputnik, a 184-pound metallic satellite the size of a beach ball, threw Americans into a frenzied state of fear. Remember, by 1957, Americans had spent nearly a decade preparing for a potential Soviet nuclear attack. So when the Soviets launched an unknown object into the skies over the Northern Hemisphere, it raised urgent questions. Questions like, were the Soviets trying to spy on us? What could satellites really do? Could this be a bomb? More importantly, Sputnik shattered the long-held illusion of American technological dominance. Simply put, we were caught with our pants down. And while American government officials knew about Sputnik's launch in advance, the public and media did not. Still, Sputnik's impact more than anything was psychological and political. So as it orbited the planet, Sputnik sent out simple beeps that radio operators around the world could easily pick up. Do you hear those now? More than anything, those beeps that you hear right now, those beeps fueled fear. But in reality, Sputnik's capabilities were very basic. In sum, It gathered data on the upper atmosphere and transmitted radio signals through the ionosphere. In layman's terms, Sputnik was the Soviet equivalent of a minimum viable product, a MVP, a proof of concept designed to showcase their technological edge and claim victory in the race to space, all while stoking American fears below. But Sputnik's launch wasn't just a Cold War flex. It signaled something much bigger. You see, satellites meant that in the very near future, we'd be able to fulfill Arthur C. Clarke's vision of sending and receiving signals around the world in real time. And while the Soviets reached space first, their dominance in the skies was short-lived. Within 6 years, the dream of commercially viable American satellites became a reality, revolutionizing television, communications, navigation, weather forecasting, and surveillance. Simply put, Sputnik woke an American giant and sparked a collective drive in America to innovate, reshaping how we connect with the world and shrinking the barriers of time and space for good. From October 4th, 1957 onward, the world grew smaller and life moved much faster. Still, for visionaries like Ted Turner, getting beat to space by the Soviets wasn't an embarrassment. It was just another stepping stone towards greater human exploration and communication. A step towards bringing the world together. As Ted once said, quote, "Someday, I'm going to be the first person in the history of the world to talk to everyone. I'll be able to talk to all the world's leaders and bring peace to the world through television." End quote. You see, satellites were transformative, and they quickly revealed a very powerful truth. Control the satellites, and you control the next great source of global power and influence. And while that's true, the real revolution wasn't the satellite itself. No, it was the technologies and possibilities it unlocked. By the mid-1970s, for many, widespread adoption of the satellite was still years away. But for Ted Turner, it was his Trojan horse. I'm Webb Barr, host of Media Moguls, bringing you stories of how we got to now in media and entertainment. This is episode 4 of Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga. The satellite brings us Superstation.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
What we're doing right here on this spot is the greatest advance in television since television was invented.
They're risk takers, rule breakers, and empire builders. These are the stories of the visionaries who transform media forever.
Whatever I have is being put at risk on this project, and if it's not successful, I'll be looking for a job.
Going to Bernard Shaw.
Tear down this wall.
From High Bar, this is Media Moguls.
We won't be signing off until the world ends. We'll be on, we will cover it live.
Hello and welcome back to Media Moguls. I am your host, Webb Barr, and together we are going to be traversing across time and space for all things media history. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't listened to the first 3 episodes of Media Moguls, you can go back and listen to those anytime. If you'd like to start here, totally fine with me too. Also, just know that some episodes going forward are going to be much longer than the first 2. Feel free to pause those and come back to them later. Treat this kind of like an audiobook with more excitement, passion, and it's not boring. Okay, let's get started. I've said this a few times already, but media is an industry where all the pieces matter. In order to understand where we are today, we first need to understand the past, right? That's how history works. So before diving into Ted Turner's national cable dream, let's take a step back and I will guide you through the history of satellites, how they work, and how everything came together leading to HBO's groundbreaking 1975 Thrilla in Manila broadcast. Or is that a narrowcast? I'm not sure. Do they have enough of an audience to be a broadcast? Now, satellites are one of the most important inventions of the last 100 years. But because they're out of sight, we tend to take them for granted. And most of the times we forget they're even up there, right? And so on July 10th, 1962, after years of work by more than 400 people, at a cost of over $50 million, the first active communication satellite Telstar I was launched into orbit. Weighing just 170 pounds and measuring under 3 feet in diameter, the magnesium-framed satellite looked unassuming. Its surface was covered with 3,600 sapphire-encrusted solar cells powering over 10,000 electronic components inside. Looking at it, you would never have guessed that it had the power to connect the world. But it did. From its orbit, Telstar I could, just as Arthur C. Clarke predicted, receive phone calls and TV signals beamed to Earth and instantly send them back to receiving stations on the ground. It was a faster, more widespread, and most importantly, cheaper way to transmit information and data than the existing ground-based networks. Telstar I was made possible by billions of dollars in public research, funding by NASA, and launched for AT&T, who'd been relaying TV programs from station to station since the dawn of network broadcasting in the mid-1940s. With Telstar's arrival, AT&T's role expanded from simply relaying TV shows across the country to connecting continents. This arrangement raised big questions like who got to decide which programs were broadcast internationally and under what conditions? Beyond the domestic concerns, the very nature of satellites orbiting high above Earth was bound to introduce a number of new challenges when it came to international relations. Despite these outstanding questions and concerns, the Kennedy administration moved fast. You see, they saw satellite communication as a key symbol of international power, which it was, especially since this is all happening at arguably the height of the Cold War. And they were determined to avoid the usual bureaucratic traps and slowdowns that come with most major government initiatives. So what did they do? Kennedy's drive led to the Communications Satellite Act of 1962, which was passed just a month after Telstar I's launch. The act handed international satellite communications over to the private sector by creating the Communications Satellite Corporation, better known as ComSat. Modeled after the Navy's creation of RCA in 1919, ComSat's board included government representatives, but the real control was shared by 4 companies: AT&T, RCA, Western Union, and International Telephone and Telegraph. Then, on July 23, 1962, as Telstar orbited Earth at 18,000 miles per hour, broadcasters from the Big Three networks teamed up with their European counterparts to make broadcast and communications history. Legendary CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite hosted the first live transatlantic broadcast on a TV show called America, July 23, 1962. That night, a signal traveled from Maine to the Telstar satellite and then down to receivers in England and France, allowing as many as 100 million Europeans to see live images from across America. Sure, the video quality wasn't perfect or even good, but that wasn't the point. The breakthrough was proving that satellites could deliver the world to you in real time. That was the revolutionary act. And in the process, Walter Cronkite became the first televised American voice heard live across the ocean in 16 countries. Cronkite truly collapsed time and space. In his signature warm tone, Cronkite spoke over live side-by-side footage of the Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower, saying,
"Good evening, Europe. This is the North American continent live via AT&T Telstar, July 23rd, 1962, 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in the east. The New York skyline on the Atlantic Ocean. And that's the Brooklyn Bridge. On the west, 3,000 miles away, San Francisco. 12 noon at the Golden Gate Bridge, high above the entrance of San Francisco Harbor. The same sun, which has just set over the Mediterranean and the English Channel, has reached its zenith here, but is above the clouds hanging over San Francisco. On the north, one of the longest unguarded borders on this planet. This is Niagara Falls, part of the Canadian-U.S. frontier that extends from New Brunswick to British Columbia on the Pacific. On the south, the Rio Grande River, for 1,000 miles, the only border between Mexico and the United States. Here, the cities of Juarez, Mexico, and El Paso, Texas, touch. Between these two borders, between these two oceans, 180 million Americans have begun another week. We'll visit with some of them in a moment. The plain facts of electronic life are that Washington and the Kremlin are now no farther apart than the speed of light, at least technically. That what goes on in the United Nations building in New York can be seen in Belgrade and in Paris and in Bonn. Until today, the three television networks of the United States, ABC, CBS, NBC, have spoken in only one language. Today, we begin to speak in many tongues, and a group of our fellow correspondents are now narrating to you in 6 languages. We in television are convinced that the ability to portray immediacy, to realize what's new, what's going on, is the true significance of this new communications bridge. These first 18 minutes will attempt to show you a few of the things that are going on right now on the North American continent. I'm Walter Cronkite.
It's pretty incredible, right? You can feel Cronkite's amazement as viewers watch footage from another continent. It gives me goosebumps. My favorite Cronkite moment is when Apollo 11 is landing on the moon and he takes off his glasses and rubs his hands and just smiles. But this is pretty cool too. Now, the original plan called for President Kennedy to open the show, but when he wasn't ready, producers made a game time decision to send the feed to America's Pastime instead. And in doing so, they made history once again. You see, this wasn't just any baseball game. It was the first live international sports broadcast, coming live from Wrigley Field, where the Chicago Cubs were playing the Philadelphia Phillies. Cubs announcer Jack Brickhouse spoke directly to his new and confused international audience.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have just been informed that this baseball game is being seen in Europe right now over the Telstar satellite. Let's give all the baseball fans in Europe a big hello from Chicago.
No score in the ball game. This point, the Phillies, no runs, 1 hit, no errors. The Cubs, no runs, 2 hits, no errors.
Well, we realize that all of this doesn't make much sense to you folks in Europe, but if we hadn't shown you a bit of our national game on this first transatlantic show, we'd never have heard the end of it. As a matter of fact, right now, our colleagues who are doing the translating are going crazy trying to say runs, hits, and errors in Swedish and Italian. In any case, here it is, a brief glimpse of American baseball played in the biggest arena in the world, all the way from Wrigley Field in Chicago to the Coliseum in Rome.
By the time President Kennedy spoke, he did his JFK speech thing, where he elevated the moment with his iconic style, saying,
I understand that part of today's press conference is being relayed by the Telstar communications satellite to viewers across the Atlantic, and this is another indication of the extraordinary world in which we live. This satellite must be high enough to carry messages from both sides of the world, which is, of course, a very essential requirement for peace, and I think this understanding, which will inevitably come from the speedier communications, is bound to increase the well-being and security of all people here and those across the oceans. So we're glad to participate in this operation developed by private industry, launched by government in admirable cooperation.
A new world of possibilities was now open. In less than 6 years, we went from fearing harmless Soviet beeps in orbit to transmitting live video across oceans. That's how fast this stuff moves. The possibilities seemed endless, but so did the questions it raised. Questions like, could live TV eliminate global division? Would real-time international communication help prevent wars? Or would it blur cultural boundaries with individual cultures fading away? Would we become the united world of America? Still, it's worth noting that even as satellite technology was rapidly advancing, regular live international broadcasts were still years away. This was almost like a novelty. For now, the real impact of instant global communication was anyone's guess. Now, here's the thing about Telstar 1. It was both a success and a failure. You see, Telstar succeeded by getting into orbit, which was, of course, a huge accomplishment. But by the time it got there, its technology was already outdated. It was obsolete, as it was only limited to transmitting where it had a direct line of sight, which, when you're talking about global communications, is not actually ideal, right? It wasn't the same synchronous satellite Arthur C. Clarke envisioned years before, but it did offer a glimpse of what a fully connected world might one day look like. In the end, Telstar I didn't last long. Radiation from a nuclear test soon rendered it useless. But Telstar's early demise didn't slow things down. ComSat pushed forward, bringing Arthur C. Clarke's vision closer to reality with the launch of the first synchronous satellite in 1963. That's a very quick turnaround. That's how this happens. Quick. A ComSat official summed up the rapid pace of development, saying, quote, "It's like being ordered to organize a worldwide airline 6 months after the Wright brothers first flew." End quote. With strong backing from the Kennedy administration, satellites continued advancing at a breakneck pace. The goal? Get as many countries as possible on a ComSat satellite system before rival nations could build their own competing networks. To make that happen, the United States government offered financial and military aid to developing nations, helping them construct massive ground stations with 100-foot satellite dishes, each costing somewhere between $3 and $7 million. It's a good example of how the United States government can drive a global agenda when it serves their own interests. Today, technology companies use similar strategies to incentivize developers to build on their platforms. But this isn't new. It's just what it takes to make sure your technology wins out, right? Still, even as satellites kept improving, they weren't commercially available in the early 1970s, so TV signals still relied on antennas, cables, and microwave towers. All of that changed when HBO went live on the SATCOM-1 satellite at the end of 1975. But before we dive into that, let's take a step back and look at how things worked before satellites. You see, before satellites, broadcast TV sent their signals into our homes via microwaves, which sounds very hot, right? These microwaves were then picked up by rabbit ears on our TV sets or rooftop antennas. Their signals then and now were easily disrupted by rain, mountains, and even the buildings in big cities, sometimes blocking transmissions completely. Remember, in episode 2, I explained at length about how these very issues led to the birth of cable in 1949. Here's a quick refresher. Back then, the cable cowboys put up these super tall, massive towers, often on top of mountains in areas with bad reception or no reception at all, so that they could capture broadcast signals from the sky and deliver clear TV signals to homes via coaxial cable. The next leap for cable distribution came via microwave towers that relayed these signals from one tower to the next. This innovation led to the creation of more regional cable fiefdoms, where operators were able to extend a channel's reach, like Ted Turner's WTCG in Atlanta, up to 500 miles away. Originally, WTCG Channel 17 only had a broadcast range of about 45 miles. To extend its range, additional towers had to be placed roughly every 25 miles. Now, these microwave towers weren't perfect. There were drawbacks for sure. For one, they were very expensive to maintain and vulnerable to bad weather. So if one tower went down, the whole chain could be affected. This meant that the idea of relaying Ted's Channel 17 signal from Atlanta to, say, Chicago, or even further, was both impractical and cost prohibitive. Remember, in the early 1970s, cable programming was limited to whatever the networks and independent stations like Ted's offered. But the commercialization of satellites changed everything, expanding options for programming while driving down costs of expansion. Now, that's what I call an actual game changer. When I started working on this project, I knew next to nothing about satellites. They're just in the sky. I knew more about Dave Matthews Band's song satellites than actual satellites. They're one of those technologies, kind of like computer chips, that are extremely important and you need them. But since you don't see them, you kind of forget they exist, right? I need to explain in layman's terms how satellites work. So here's how satellites work. A satellite sits high above the weather, about 22,000 miles up, while an Earth station, which is a powerful ground-based transmitter, beams a TV signal up to it. The satellite catches that TV signal and instantly sends it back down to dish-shaped receivers, which are known as ground stations across the country, or ground receiving stations. Since the signal travels straight through the atmosphere, there's almost no interference, which results in a pretty incredible picture and clarity that network TV just did not have. Rabbit ear antennas could not do what satellite programming could. At their core, communication satellites are simply orbiting antennas that receive signals from Earth and rebroadcast them across vast distances, sometimes thousands of miles. They are incredible technologies. To say they're leaps and bounds above what microwave towers were doing would be an understatement. In Porter Bibb's It Ain't As Easy As It Looks, Ted Turner's amazing story, he explains this amazing fact. Quote, a television signal makes the 44,600-mile round trip in less than a fifth of a second and can be received anywhere on Earth within the satellite's footprint. End quote. That is insane. Less than a fifth of a second. That's so fast. Now, you might think that satellite transmission would be more expensive than using microwave towers, right? But even in 1975, a satellite cost only a fraction of the cost of stringing together microwave towers from mountaintop to mountaintop while delivering better quality and reliability. It sounds like a perfect product, right? It's cheaper and it's better. So it would seem like a no-brainer for other companies, even the networks, to adopt these satellites, right? Not exactly. You see, people back then really had a hard time grasping the magic of satellites. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around invisible data being beamed back and forth to Earth, right? Especially in the 70s, yet satellites like Satcom-1 provided Ted Turner's Channel 17 with over 1 million square miles of instant coverage and could do the same for more than 20 additional TV and radio stations simultaneously. It's incredible. In a world of bunny ears with just 3 major channels, it's really hard to imagine. And even harder to convince someone you should do it, right? Especially when you are an incumbent like NBC, ABC, or CBS, and you've got, 96, 97% of the total audience. Why would you need the satellite? Still, satellites hovering 22,300 miles above Earth in stationary orbit, just as Arthur C. Clarke envisioned, would go on to change the world in unimaginable ways. Okay, that's enough on how satellites work and why they offer cable a far better future than the microwave tower. Better picture, cheaper, press one button, and you get the whole country. By now, you know how satellites work and why they promise to transform the world, right? Yet, in the early 1970s, hardly anyone, including HBO's Jerry Levin and Ted Turner, truly grasped just how revolutionary satellites would become. The broadcast industry certainly didn't. They gladly paid AT&T's steep fees to distribute their programming from station to station nationwide. Fees that also served as insanely high barriers to entry, which kept potential competition at bay. There is a reason why new networks don't just spring up, right? So, while everyone agreed that satellite distribution was the future, no one was really sure when it would take off, or if it would simply reinforce the power of the incumbents. That's always the fear with this kind of thing, especially when you're not necessarily standing on the shoulder of giants when we talk about technology. Meanwhile, the biggest obstacle for a cable service like HBO was growth, or more specifically, getting more subscribers. And well, microwave towers work until they don't, right? Any hope of expanding beyond the Northeast, outside their tower's reach, was pretty much impossible. It just wasn't scalable. One tower goes down, and that's the game. That's the whole system. It's a cascading waterfall kind of effect. In James Andrew Miller's excellent book on HBO, Tinderbox, former HBO executive Stu Chismere explained, quote, up until that time, getting a signal to a sorely needed new affiliate required a leg analysis, which involved plotting out various microwave paths to see whether the prospect was economical. The satellite made it possible to hit a dish anywhere in the country was a godsend and put us on the map, end quote. So they could press one button and go nationwide, provided the cable system had a receiving dish to pull the signal down from the satellite. I'm going to re-emphasize that over and over because it's a little confusing, but it's really simple at the same time. So in Timing's home box office, a regional cable service offering movies to subscribers, decided to go national using the newly launched RCA satellite. It was a bold bet the farm type of gamble. Time Inc. authorized its executive in charge of HBO, Jerry Levin, to spend the $9 million required for a long-term lease on RCA's SATCOM-1 satellite. At that time, only 2 Earth stations in the United States could even receive the signal, and no one knew when more would become available. This is kind of like launching an internet company and only 2 places can distribute it to their audiences. So say you start an internet company and only Topeka, Kansas and Richmond, Virginia can get it. You're just hoping that other cable services are going to be able to get it and that they understand that this investment in their ground station to pull down HBO signal is worth their money. Even with Satcom in orbit, HBO and Levin had their work cut out for them. You see, to pick up HBO signal, cable operators had to invest $100,000 in a 30-foot dish, which amounted to a massive bet on the satellite's technology, especially since HBO was the only satellite channel available at the time. But someone has to be first, right? They're just betting $9 million and then hoping that the cable systems also bet $100,000 each to bring new programming to their services because they were hungry for growth, right? Still, Jerry Levin's resolve and long-term vision for HBO cannot be overstated. Now, bear with me for a second, but let's imagine you're a Time Inc. executive, maybe at Sports Illustrated or Time Magazine, or better yet, you're a member of the board, and you see this little regional cable division planning to spend millions of dollars of magazine revenue to get HBO onto a satellite as a bet on the future of cable being hugely lucrative. So you're betting on the future of cable being gigantically lucrative. All the while, inflation is soaring, and the future of cable, pay TV, and satellite distribution are anything but certain, okay? Remember, Time Inc. is known for Time Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Fortune, and Life magazine, not television, and certainly not HBO in the early 1970s. So yeah, calling this bet on the satellite a leap of faith would be very factual. It's really unbelievable that they had the vision and foresight to make this investment. Now, obviously, it's going to pay off for Time Inc., but culturally, it sets a bit of a us versus them dynamic inside of the company. We're going to talk about Time Inc. a lot more in future seasons. Now, I have to give Time Inc.'s board a ton of credit for sticking with HBO and walking the walk with the satellite. Because in today's era of managing expectations on a day-to-day basis, certainly on a quarterly basis, in a real-time news cycle, I doubt they would have done that today. Because with only 2 Earth stations capable of receiving HBO signal, HBO and Time basically had to hold their breath and wait for the entire satellite cable market to catch up to their revolutionary idea. And even then, they still had to hope that audiences would pay for their subscription service. Ultimately, it would take more than 2 years before HBO knew that its satellite move had actually paid off. But until then, it was all about survival. Full stop. Now, someone very familiar with survival and betting it all was, of course, Ted Turner, who also saw the satellite as an opportunity of a lifetime. Just as HBO proved satellites could deliver TV signals nationwide, Ted saw an opportunity to turn Channel 17, his regional cable station, into a national network using this novel technology. Remember, cable systems were hungry for the kind of unique programming Ted's station aired, and national advertisers meant more revenue, right? Or at least in theory. That was what Ted envisioned when he set his sights on getting onto the satellite. Now, back in episode 2, I talked about how an FCC rule change in 1972 allowed cable systems to import distant station signals, like Ted's in Atlanta, and how it was an instant game changer for Ted, since suddenly allowed his struggling UHF station the opportunity to expand outside of Atlanta, right? As WTCG expanded beyond its 45-mile broadcast range, first to Columbus and Macon, Georgia, and then via microwave tower as far south as Tallahassee, Florida, Channel 17's audience, along with its future, skyrocketed. Yes, microwave towers were expensive, but they let Ted expand his reach. while offering the South an alternative to the network's homogenous programming and giving even more fans a chance to watch nearly every single Atlanta Braves game. Still, at first, Ted hoped microwave towers could take WTCG nationwide, starting with the South. But as you know, microwave transmission was too expensive, too slow, and couldn't reach far enough to match his nationwide vision. And while satellites had unlimited potential, in the 1970s, the real power still belonged to the networks. On any given night in the mid-1970s, 7 out of 10 viewers were watching CBS, NBC, or ABC. The only national cable service was HBO, which was still small and required both a cable subscription and paying an extra monthly fee. Plus, there weren't many cable providers who had the dish to pull HBO down, right? Before satellites changed everything, ABC, NBC, and CBS dominated American living rooms thanks to their exclusive wire distribution system. The thing you don't really see is often a competitive advantage. You see, over-the-air broadcast signals only travel 50 miles. So in order to reach audiences nationwide, the networks partnered with AT&T to create this massive wire network that transmitted their programming over long distances to local stations across the country, who then broadcasted the programming to rooftop antennas and rabbit ears locally. At the time, out of the nation's 700 local TV stations, 600 were network affiliates. These affiliates aired network programming in exchange for a cut of the advertising revenue. Now, using AT&T's landlines was expensive, about 75 cents per mile per hour, a price that quickly added up for would-be competitors, right? Not that there weren't any, because here's the kicker. The networks got a 90% discount from AT&T thanks to their heavy usage. And if you wanted to compete with them, you'd need AT&T to install $15 million worth of equipment, something they'd only do if you were able to guarantee $50 million in revenue within 3 years. Hardly a easy ask for a startup, right? Then you'd somehow have to convince local stations across the country to dump CBS, NBC, or ABC for your new network. So yeah, good luck, right? Meanwhile, indie stations like Ted's WTCG were really playing against a loaded deck. They had to cobble together their own programming, out-execute more popular local affiliates who were backed by the networks, and then hope for the best, all while being told to stay in their local lanes. Their only other option was to use microwave towers, which, as I just explained, were unreliable and very expensive. And that's not even counting the cost of creating or licensing new shows to fill a programming schedule, plus all of the equipment and startup costs and employees. It was a nearly impossible battle. Think about it. From the start of network television until the mid-1980s, not a single new national broadcast network emerged. It wasn't until Rupert Murdoch launched Fox that anyone broke through. I think that tells you something, right? The barriers to entry were massive. It wasn't just about money. This system was built to stop new competition, at least in the traditional sense where a newcomer tries to do things the same way as the big three. But the biggest barrier to entry is distribution. If you wanted to take on the networks in the mid-1970s, you needed an entirely new way to get your programming to viewers. And just as important as the network's landline advantage with AT&T was the government's role in shaping cable's future. Cable Cowboy and TCI CEO John Malone doubted Ted could pull off turning his regional station into a national network using satellite, mostly because he didn't think the FCC would ever let it happen. But in May 1974, FCC Chairman Richard Wiley called for more programming diversity on TV, and Congress backed him with buzzwords like decentralization. Ultimately, two key factors made Ted's national cable dream even possible. First, in 1975, the FCC loosened several restrictions on cable, hoping to jumpstart the industry. Part of this had to do with Congress's eagerness to break the big three networks' total grip on TV. You know, they liked the networks, but they didn't like how powerful they were. They were insanely powerful. And second, In late 1975, RCA launched its first communications satellite, which instantly took HBO and cable TV nationwide. Now, Ted's stroke of genius was recognizing that satellites could beam his TV signal anywhere in the country, as long as there was a satellite dish to receive it. Still, Ted's idea of an ad-supported national cable channel distributed nationwide by satellite made very little sense to anyone. Not because it was too expensive or unrealistic, but simply because no one had done it before. And the idea that Ted Turner could take a local UHF TV station in Atlanta, best known for airing Atlanta Braves games, old movies, and black and white TV reruns, and turn that into a national network, all without the major networks really noticing, was completely preposterous. It was a very radical, contrarian idea. Now, at the same time, Ted's idea had the ability to give the cable industry exactly what it needed: more unique and differentiated programming, including live sports like his Atlanta Braves, and a vast library of TV shows and movies that might have otherwise been forgotten, because there's no VHS, there's no VCR, there's no Blockbuster. Meanwhile, cable providers were focused on gaining subscribers. Remember, before HBO and Channel 17, cable was mostly for people who couldn't get network signals, whether due to terrain, distance, or simply being out of reach. Cable offered a simple solution. Providers put up tall antennas, picked up network broadcasts, and delivered them to subscribers. But with channels like HBO or the Superstation TBS, cable operators finally had something unique to offer, even though it was still regional and by microwave tower. WTCG was available in the South and HBO in the Northeast, but neither was available nationwide until the satellite changed it all. The more channels cable providers added, the more subscribers they might attract. Then, with the FCC relaxing cable regulations in 1974 and satellites unlocking nationwide potential, cable suddenly had a chance at challenging the networks. But that felt years away. It felt impossible. No matter how big or small the opportunity was, it's important to remember just how dominant the big three were in the mid-1970s. They dominated television with more than 95% of the audience tuned in every night. To compete with the networks, you had to stand out, operate differently, offer alternatives, and find a new way to distribute your programming. You could not go wired on AT&T, or else you would be SOL. And that's exactly what Ted Turner's WTCG and Jerry Levin's HBO did. Now, in the decade after Telstar I's launch, a number of companies experimented with satellites, but none found commercial success. And it's pretty easy to see why. You see, as early as 1967, AT&T saw satellites as a threat to its landline monopoly, and rightfully so. So instead of innovating, they lobbied Washington, D.C. to slow the satellite's commercial development down, even while working on their own satellite plans as a hedge. I guess that's the cost of doing business. But AT&T wasn't about to jeopardize its cash cow, you know. The lucrative phone lines and communication systems the networks paid a fortune to use, even though they got a huge discount. So, despite satellites being a proven technology for almost a decade, their development and adoption inside AT&T stalled, all to protect their monopoly. Ed Taylor, who I'll talk about shortly, was the architect behind AT&T's satellite plans, and later admitted that AT&T's lobbyists were so effective that satellites did not become operational commercially until 1972, 10 years after Telstar launched. What I'm saying is this: AT&T's lobbying efforts were basically like the Pittsburgh Steelers' Iron Curtain defense. You know, blocking anything that threatened their dominance. But they did it through lobbying and regulatory capture. Now, I say all of this to emphasize just how rigged the system was in favor of the networks, and what Ted Turner and the Cable Cowboys were really up against in the 1970s. Remember, in the 70s, America was glued to their TVs, with more than 70 million people watching primetime TV every night. And if you wanted to compete against the networks or just offer an alternative, there were enormous barriers to entry. But by 1974, after years of regulatory delays and opposition from the networks and AT&T, the government finally gave the green light for commercial satellites, pending FCC approval. With satellites now in play, the long-awaited promise of cheaper, more reliable transmission and better picture quality was finally within reach. But most importantly, for the first time, satellites introduced real competition for the networks. Not that they were really paying that close of attention. This was the moment cable operators and programmers had been waiting for. Now, Ted's desire to get up on the bird wasn't driven by altruism or ego. It was all part of his brilliant strategy. You see, Ted's vision for Channel 17 was to become the nation's fourth network. And not only that, he wanted to take on the big boys and beat them at their own game. A game no one else could afford to play before satellites came along. Longtime Turner executive Terry McGurk told Christian Williams, quote, "The satellite really intrigued Ted. Ted loves to step into the unknown. And when he went off on the SUPERSTATION tangent, I don't think anybody in his company really knew what he was up to. Ted once said to me, if they gave me all the McDonald's franchises in the country, I wouldn't take it. It would be too easy. That he'd make a lot of money, but it'd be a no-brainer. He'd die of boredom in a minute," end quote. So that's the kind of guy we're dealing with when we're talking about Ted. He wants things to be more difficult because he's excited about taking on the big boys. He is David against Goliath. Now, what Ted loved about the satellite was really its simplicity. All he had to do was build an Earth station in Atlanta, and with the press of a button, WTCG signal would be beamed to the satellite in space, where it would then be pulled back down by the cable system's ground stations across the country. And just like that, Channel 17 would go from a regional cable station to a super station. That's power. And it didn't hurt. The cable providers were hungry for new and differentiated programming, something Ted Turner could deliver in droves. Now, I'm sure you're wondering whose idea was it to put WTCG on the satellite? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some would say it's Ted's sports consigliere, Don Anderson. Others credit CNN co-founder Reese Schonfeld. Another key influence was Andy Goldman, a marketing executive at Teleprompter, which was one of the biggest cable providers back then. You see, 4 years before Ted got on the satellite, Goldman convinced him to let Teleprompter's Alabama cable system carry WTCG for free, giving 200,000 subscribers some extra programming. Ted loved telling advertisers that his Atlanta-based station was reaching cable viewers via microwave tower in Alabama. Even in the early 70s, cable, building strong, long-lasting relationships was everything. It remains that way today. These connections didn't just help cable operators compete with the networks and lobby Congress. They helped expand programming like Ted's to more cable systems. It was very much a rising tide lifts all boats kind of situation because these kinds of things grew the entire industry. They needed more people to subscribe, and you didn't subscribe nationally to cable. You subscribed based on where you were. So 4 years later, Alex Goldman, now a vice president at Teleprompter, called Ted with an even bigger idea. Quote, "Why not put your Atlanta station on Satcom 1 and beam it to every city in America?" End quote. Ted thought this idea was brilliant. He knew it'd be expensive in the short term, but if he really wanted to compete with the networks, microwave towers just weren't going to cut it. To Ted, the networks were like a modern version of World War II's Maginot Line defending France from Germany, impregnable to a frontal assault, but vulnerable from a different angle. And in his mind, the satellite was his blitzkrieg. They wouldn't see it coming, right? Now, to leapfrog the entire broadcast industry, all Ted had to do was comply with the FCC, spend millions of dollars on an Earth station, and secure one of the few last spots on RCA's Satcom 1 satellite. This wasn't just a path forward. It was his only path forward. The more Ted thought about it, the more he believed that he could make $1 billion. And he was not alone in his optimism. Remember, HBO beat Ted to the satellite by a year. But he saw that as an opportunity. It was an invaluable chance to study their approach, figure out what worked, what didn't, and get all of his ducks in a row while hoping the market, which was cable providers, caught up to their vision. Here's Ted later describing the satellite and how HBO inspired him.
Was where there was not the full component of broadcast network, where they had signal, they were deprived signal-wise in these smaller markets. I figured later we'd wire the whole country, and the cable guys didn't believe it, not even the cable operators. I said, we're going to wire Boston and New York and L.A. They said, no, we aren't. We're only going to be out here in the boonies. That's all we'll ever be. I said, don't say that, because that's the only way I can compete with CBS, NBC, and ABC is to be everywhere like they are. So you are going to wire it. I said, you build the wires, and I'll make the wires sing. I'll deliver the customers. I'll program it.
That's great. And you showed them. You showed the networks and the Superstation.
Right. We did. We did. It took a long time, you know. It took 20 years. It took a lifetime.
Well, certainly in '76, with Satcom 2, that made it a lot easier. Tell me about that.
Well, that was a satellite. The satellite, I read about it. You know, Broadcasting Magazine. Here's a satellite, you know. The first thing was Sputnik, you know, went around the earth. You know, the Russians had the first one. And, but HBO, actually, Jerry Levin, up at time with HBO, they decided to go on satellite with HBO. And I said, well, if they can do it, I can do it. Oh, I'll see if I can do it. I knew as a local station it was going to be tricky because I was just licensed to serve the Atlanta market. But I knew that the Congress wanted to see competition to ABC, NBC, and CBS, so I became pro-competition. I went to Washington and started lobbying. I just, you know, bought a ticket to Washington and started seeing senators and congressmen, you know. Next thing I know, it happened. It happened.
Still, even in 1974, everyone in broadcasting and cable knew satellites were coming. It was only a matter of time, but who would use them and how was still very much up in the air. It's kind of like 1998 on the internet, where we're all on AOL, we're still on dial-up, and we're IMing each other, and we're wondering, who's going to organize all this information? Who's going to make this even easier? Is it going to be Ask Jeeves, where you just ask and you don't get the right response? Fast forward to 2000, you get broadband, and AOL isn't a portal to the internet as much anymore, and you have Google. Anyway, by June 1974, only one channel had committed to using the satellite for cable, Jerry Levin's HBO, which planned to go national as soon as the FCC gave them the green light. Now, it helped that HBO had the financial backing of a parent company, in their case, publishing giant Time Inc., along with support from two of the nation's largest cable operators, basically saying, we believe in this, you know, it's social proof. But the real question was, who would be the next channel to take the leap? You see, the industry is full of skeptics, especially media. Some who didn't believe the satellite's hype, press a button and you go nationwide. How's that possible? While others couldn't wrap their heads around how a regional TV station could suddenly go nationwide. And honestly, I get it. It makes a lot of sense. But when there's a massive leap in technology, especially one involving space, invisible signals, and huge price tags that not only do you have to front them, but your partners, the cable operators, do too, it's really hard to grasp the implications and how this thing could make a potential impact. If you ever tried to convince someone to do something they don't want to do, they might know it's a great idea, but they might not want to do it. You know, they don't want to do it. That's kind of what a lot of these people thought. And it's even harder to get people to invest in that future. But Ted understood it. Now, at the time, aside from RCA, which built the Satcom 1 satellite that HBO used, only one other company was making satellite dishes, Scientific Atlanta, which was led by Sid Topol. They built large satellite dishes for cable systems to beam up and pull down TV signals. But they needed customers too. Enter Reese Schonfeld, a longtime newsman from New York and a name you'll want to remember for episodes ahead. For years, Reese was fascinated, if not obsessed, with satellites and their potential to break the network's decade-long grip on television, and even more importantly for Reese, on the news. Like Ted, Reese was frustrated by the status quo. AT&T's lines were too expensive, and microwave towers just couldn't cover the country reliably. Satellites just might be the answer, though. So, in June 1974, Reese flew to Atlanta to meet Sid Topol and learn more about his satellite dishes. I think he did this on his own. But when Sid picked him up at the airport, he told Reese they had to make a quick pit stop first to see another potential customer. Enter, Ted Turner, curious, excited, and eager to learn more about this game-changing technology from an expert like Sid Topol, while also figuring out just how much this investment was going to cost him. Now, back in episode 2, I talked at length about how when Ted bought his Indy UHF station in 1970, he knew absolutely nothing about television. Well, that didn't last very long. By 1973, they were profitable, so clearly he figured some things out, combined with being very smart and working his ass off. Like any hard-charging mogul, Ted wanted to win, devouring anything and everything he could that would give him an edge, while staying on top of emerging trends and technologies. What network executives had entire departments for, Ted Turner did himself. No committees, no second guessing. He made decisions fast, and everyone moved forward, right? So when Sid Topol and Reese Schonfeld arrived at WTCG and stepped into Ted's wood-paneled office, they were immediately struck by its chaotic, den-like atmosphere. Books and paper everywhere, blending into the stained carpet and yellow blinds. And right there on Ted's desk was his famous plaque that read, "Either lead, follow, or get out of the way." It's fitting, right? Brick by brick, or cinder block by cinder block. And of course, Ted's own look matched his office's vibe. Not that he cared. Appearance was never Ted Turner's thing. Growing his company and winning were. So once they got down to business, Reese Schonfeld later recalled their meeting in his memoir, Me and Ted Against the World, the unauthorized story of the founding of CNN, writing, quote, "Ted wanted to find out if satellites could help him and what they would cost. Help him do what? I did not know. But in 1974, I knew as much about satellite applications as anyone. And I knew what Western Union planned to charge for satellite time. I told Ted it would cost him $1 million a year." He said dismissively, "Is that all?" I said, "Yes." End quote. Now, as Sid and Reese left Ted's office and headed to the parking lot, Reese couldn't help but scoff, saying, quote, "Can you imagine that asshole Turner thinking he's going to put his rinky-dink channel on satellite?" End quote. Now, Ted knew the satellite was his future, later writing, quote, "Satellite, that was the big step. I'm like the bear that went over the mountain to see what he could see. One thing opened up another, and I kept moving on. Remember, I went from a small sailboat on Lake Lanier to America's Cup." End quote. So, in typical fashion, Ted went all in, learning everything he could, rallying his team and charging full speed ahead to get WTCG on the satellite. But in order for Ted to get WTCG's signal to the satellite, he needed an uplink Earth station. Ted's protege and longtime Turner executive Terry McGurk recalled, quote, "Ted said to me, 'All right, we'll build an Earth station ourselves. Next thing I know, I'm off for 6 months looking at land in Atlanta with a microwave interference pattern overlap in one hand and a real estate guy in the other. It was unbelievably complicated, and nobody really knew what was going on," end quote. There's no giants to stand on the shoulders of, guys. This is ground zero. On his rapid race to space, Ted told his biographer, Christian Williams, quote, "I wanted to be first. Damn right, you have to commit yourself," end quote. By October 1975, HBO's satellite debut with the Thrilla in Manila proved the technology worked, even if only a couple stations could receive its signal, and Ted was ready to follow suit. By early 1976, momentum surged when Teleprompter, the nation's largest cable operator at the time, bet big on satellites, when they ordered ground stations for all of their cable systems. And like any major tech shift, once one big player jumps in the water, many more followed. Within 3 years, this demand drove the cost of receive-only ground stations from $100,000 to just $25,000. Now, I know this sounds a little confusing. It definitely was for me at first, because when do you need to learn how satellites go up and down? But it's actually pretty instructive. So let me break it down in a simple way. To send a station signal up to the satellite, you needed an uplink Earth station or Earth terminal, which is a major cost for stations like TED's. They're about $1 million at the time. And in order to receive a satellite signal with all the programming and then broadcast it to all of your users, cable systems needed a receive-only Earth station, also known as a ground station, and it's basically a 30-foot wide dish. And when it came to costs, uplink Earth stations, the ones sending it to space, were these massive investments running from $750 to $1 million in the mid-1970s. Meanwhile, ground stations, which cable operators needed to receive channels and then distribute it to their users, started at $100,000 in 1975, but dropped 75% to $25,000 by the late 1970s. $25,000 is a major difference than $100,000. And all those costs don't even include getting the exclusive spot on RCA's satellite. So when Ted first approached RCA, all he wanted to do was buy a spot on their bird. But RCA shot him down, saying satellites weren't for private use. Instead, they were meant to give the networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, a cheaper alternative to AT&T's costly phone lines for linking to their affiliates. Eventually, RCA agreed to lease Ted a spot on Satcom 1, the same satellite as HBO, for $1 million per year, but only if he met two conditions. One, he had to provide his own Earth station transmitter, which is the $750,000 up to $1 million, the satellite dish to send it to space. And two, he needed FCC approval. Now, to say the $1 million transponder lease on the satellite was a huge expense for Ted would be an understatement, especially since he'd just spent $10 million he didn't have to buy the perennially bad Atlanta Braves. Remember, all of this is happening at the same time, almost in parallel. It took Ted nearly a year to raise the money for the satellite, but the fact that he pulled it off says everything you need to know about his belief in it and his superstation. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again, but so much of Ted's success comes down to pure tenacity. In the mid-1970s, despite having very little operating capital, it was his resilience, fearlessness, and refusal to accept defeat that set him apart from nearly anyone else in broadcasting. Without those intangibles, WTCG Channel 17 wouldn't have survived from 1970 to 1976, let alone 1970 itself. But now, satellite was the game changer Ted Turner had been waiting for, with the ability to transform his station from David into Goliath. And so, after securing a spot on RCA's satellite, provided he could meet their conditions, Ted wasted no time calling Sid Topol and reserving a Series 8000 satellite Earth terminal or Earth station, the satellite dish needed to beam WTCG's signal to the satellite. Then he handed Topol a check for $750,000 and casually asked him not to cash it for a few days while he figured out how to raise the money for the uplink. Incredible! Now, inside Turner Broadcasting, some thought Ted was being reckless, which is not exactly new, right? Think about it. UHF, the Atlanta Braves, WRET in Charlotte. There's a pattern here, right? One of Ted's naysayers was his CFO, which is wild. I guess it's better than having a yes man, who said, quote, he was always playing bet your company. Every project he took on had the potential to sink him. No sooner did you feel like you were comfortable and able to breathe a little bit than we'd take on some other impossible task, end quote. Gosh, that must have been the most stressful job in the entire world. You're undercapitalized and yet you're still making these huge bets. Are you sure you want to bet that, Ted? That is all of our jobs. Yeah, we're doing it. But you see, Ted wasn't like most businessmen. He didn't fear failure or embarrassment, which is a priceless trait in the unpredictable yet promising world of cable, especially in the 1970s. It's a good trait now. Years later, Ted recalled his visit to Sid Topol's office to buy WTCG's Earth station, saying, quote, "I sent you a check for my Earth station and it didn't bounce. And then I went off and became a folk hero in cable TV and forced the whole cable industry to buy your equipment so they could receive my station. And that's exactly how you got rich, right?" End quote. On the same visit, Ted pointed to his satellite dish and told his team, quote, "This is how we're going to become a national network and compete with ABC, NBC, and CBS," end quote. In Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News, Lisa Napoli described the moment. Quote, "The staff looked at him blankly as if he were speaking Greek. Even those who loved him agreed that Ted was nuts. But this cinched it. A satellite? A fourth network? Channel 17 with a bunch of wrestling and reruns and old movies and a goofy middle-of-the-night comedy newscast? Transmitted over a twisted hunk of metal shot up into the sky?" End quote. Ted inspired them, saying, quote, "Look at what they built by linking up to cable. That distribution system could take Channel 17 only so far. This will allow all of America to tune in. Crystal clear. Here was their chance to become the superstation that served the nation, to give every television viewer in the nation a choice." And once they were up on the satellite, Ted proclaimed, quote, "ABC will shrink down to a puddle like the witch and the Wizard of Oz," end quote. The room was stunned, but Ted refused to allow any negativity or doubt. None, not even for a second, shouting, quote, "The only people I want in this room are people who are going to help me," end quote. Lead, follow, or get out of the way, right? Now, you're probably wondering, why does this matter? Well, because when you're starting a revolution, disrupting entrenched institutions, which the networks were, they were institutions, not just incumbents, and challenging decades-old paradigms, you don't just need doers, you need believers. You can't afford having people who just throw their hands up saying, "It won't work, we can't do that." Progress requires boldness and optimism, because the quickest path to failure is simply a lack of belief. Ted knew pessimism easily kills big ideas. He'd seen it happen his entire life. And now, this was his chance to go big or go home. But it wasn't just about challenging the networks with his limited capital. Ted was also gearing up for a potential fight with the FCC, which at the time prohibited anyone from owning both TV programming and distribution. To work around this issue, Ted set up his Scientific Atlanta-built Earth station as a separate business, Southern Satellite Systems, SSS. But not so fast. He quickly learned he couldn't own any part of it because the FCC classified SSS as a common carrier, and at the time, broadcasters were banned from owning common carriers. Ted explained to his biographer, Christian Williams, quote, "I wanted to be first, damn right. You have to commit yourself. So I formed my own common carrier. I named it Southern Satellite Systems, and I got a contract with RCA to use their satellite. I figured that millions of dollars were going to be made just on SSS alone," end quote. He was right, but we'll talk about that later. Today, the rules are different. Just look at Netflix, which creates, owns, and distributes its own programming. But in the 1970s, Ted had no choice but to sell his new Southern Satellite Systems to comply with FCC regulations. And more importantly, it had to go to someone he trusted. Now, make no mistake, whoever got Southern Satellite Systems was getting the deal of a lifetime. Turns out that lucky person was Ed Taylor, a satellite industry veteran who had worked on AT&T's satellite projects less than a decade before and knew firsthand how much AT&T had stalled satellite development to protect their monopoly. We discussed him earlier in this episode. So Ted made him an offer he couldn't refuse, Godfather style, selling SSS to him for the grand total of $1. $1? That's wild. Later, Ed Taylor admitted he owed Ted big time, saying, quote, "Yeah, Ted did spend a mad weekend in Atlanta convincing my wife and me that we should be so foolish as to pay him $1 for this company called SSS, which he found he could not continue with himself. Ted said, 'Here, take 10 cents per subscriber as your fee. I'm going to have a lot of subscribers, and you'll make $1 million off my station alone within a year. Doing the math, this meant if Ted's Superstation was carried in, say, 5 million homes, then Ed Taylor would make $6 million a year. Not a bad return on investment, right? $1. That's pretty insane, and it's an incredible opportunity. So, of course, Ed Taylor took the deal, acquiring SSS, Southern Satellite System, a paper corporation created solely to send Ted's programming to RCA's satellite. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, all of this seems very inevitable. That's how a lot of this stuff ends up seeming. But Ted's story is, it shouldn't feel inevitable because all of it's insane how much it works out, at least in the first 15 years. But make no mistake about it, inevitable or not, Ted Turner being the maverick that pushed cable's future on the satellite wasn't a coincidence or luck. It was pure tenacity. Before Channel 17 went nationwide with its iconic tagline, "The Superstation that serves the nation," most people thought Ted was crazy to think anyone outside Atlanta would want to watch his station. That was just the conventional wisdom in 1976. You know, TV, like radio, was more local, right? But think about it. Why wouldn't viewers outside Atlanta want to watch Channel 17? It had proven evergreen programming, including a massive library of classic TV shows and movies available only on his station, plus more live sports than had ever been aired on TV before. Remember, episode 3 is all about how the networks don't really air more than 1 or 2 baseball games a week. And even in 1984, CBS was airing the NBA Finals on tape delay. So sports are not that big of a deal to the networks, but to Southerners who have Ted's station, they want to watch the Hawks and the Braves, right? And unlike HBO, which required a monthly subscription, Ted's channel was free and on the air 24/7. Very few channels could say that. Remember, from the first day he owned WTCG, Ted's biggest advantage was counter-programming the networks and leaning into live sports in quantity. While the conventional wisdom said Americans wouldn't want a national channel of programming from Atlanta, Ted's thinking was more like, if viewers in Atlanta, Knoxville, Muscle Shoals, and Tallahassee like WTCG, then why wouldn't Iowans, Washingtonians, or Alaskans, right? Which makes a lot of sense. And if you need any proof that Ted wasn't bound by the traditional norms of television, remember, his local news aired at 3 in the morning. By June 1976, WTCG was just 7 months away from launching on the satellite. At this point, Ted had already expanded his footprint to 95 cable systems across 6 southeastern states, reaching an estimated 440,000 households, all via microwave tower. But that was basically the limit for how far his microwaves could go. But with his new satellite, Ted could reach the entire country with the press of a button. Now, when people talk about cable today, it's often in the past tense, as if cable is this supernova fading into obscurity, which to some degree it is. I mean, I think there's 55 to 60 million people still subscribe to cable, but each year it dims a little bit more until one day it'll just be gone, right? But in the 70s, cable was an emerging disruptive technology with huge potential. That is, as long as the government stayed out of the way. You could say the internet in the late 1990s was a similar story. Anyways, in order for cable to win in the mid-1970s and on, a lot of things really needed to go right. When it comes to government regulation of new technology, whether it's cable, the internet, AI, or something we haven't even imagined yet, I try not to hold my breath. Things move slow in DC for a reason. In Silicon Valley, they would say it's a feature, not a bug. And let's be honest, in 1975-76, the FCC was firmly in the networks and AT&T's pocket. You know, they had a lot of money to lobby with and a lot of dominance to protect. At the same time, technology was advancing fast and the FCC was completely out of its element, struggling to keep up with the latest improvements with cable and satellite distribution. There's no surprise there, right? Now, earlier in this episode, I mentioned how AT&T had successfully lobbied Congress for years to stall commercial satellite competition. After all, AT&T had a monopoly to protect, right? But the FCC couldn't just sit back and let the world pass them by forever. At some point, they'd need to rewrite the rules to include how satellites would fit into the bigger picture, right? At this point, Ted had already invested $1.75 million into his Earth station, that was the SSS thing, she sold to Ed Taylor, and a spot on RCA Satcom 1, that was $1 million. The only thing standing between him and his national superstation cable dream was FCC approval. The problem? No one could tell Ted how or if his plan to put WTCG on the satellite was even allowed under FCC regulations. That's how opaque all this was. Not a small thing, right? Think about it. You've already sunk millions of dollars into a project that a lot of people think is out of your league. The networks aren't even touching this. They think that AT&T is going to save the day and that basically their moat around distribution is going to last forever. And Ted doesn't know if he's even allowed to get on the satellite. He knows he's bought a spot. He knows he's built a dish, but then Ted got an answer. Kind of. The FCC basically told him, and I'm going to paraphrase this, we don't have any rules for what you're trying to do. So you might as well apply for clearance and see what happens. Whether the FCC realized this or not, a new market in broadcasting was forming, and Ted Turner was first in line. So he grabbed all the necessary paperwork and headed back to Atlanta, anxious but determined to see his satellite vision through. Now, if you think about it, today's world is full of rules. But what would you do if you'd invested millions of dollars in a venture with no clear rules, only to find out that literally everything that you'd invested in hinged on government approval? And that approval was coming from the same government agency that was already being heavily lobbied by the big three networks, AT&T, the sports leagues, and Hollywood. And how many of them liked Ted Turner and what he was doing? I could tell you that it is absolutely zero. That's some real pressure. Turner executive Terry McGurk recalled, quote, "For a while, even Ted wondered what he'd gotten into. It was so impossibly complicated. We had committed millions of dollars not knowing what the FCC would do. A lot of times, nobody understood what was happening except Ted. And people would say to me, I hope he knows what he's doing, because nobody else does." I was still new at the time, but one day at 8:30 in the morning, I got a call from Ted at his office in the Stadium Club, and he said, "Come right over," end quote. When McGurk arrived, Ted seemed really down and asked him, quote, "Am I crazy? Am I absolutely out of my mind? Is this whole thing gonna collapse around me?" End quote. Now imagine your boss coming to you and saying, "Am I out of my mind? Are we screwed here?" And Ted's not putting other people's money on the line. He's doubling down. Now, Ted's bold satellite plan clearly wasn't illegal, but it still hinged on the FCC. In his Ted Turner biography, Porter Bibb described it as, quote, "just setting precedent and setting the rest of the broadcast world on its ear. Putting up his own Earth station didn't exactly make him an outlaw, but it didn't take away any of his appeal either as an incipient folk hero," end quote. Ted waited 6 long months for the FCC's decision, but then on December 17, 1976, a little more than a year after HBO launched on the satellite, the FCC finally approved Southern Satellite's application as common carrier, officially clearing Ted to go national. Within hours of the FCC's approval, Ted flipped the switch and beamed WTCG's signal to Satcom 1. His superstation was officially live. And that wasn't all. In addition to approving Ted, the FCC, anticipating growing demand from cable providers, decided to cut the required size of satellite ground stations, the satellite dishes on the ground that pull the signal down from the satellite, from 30 feet to 15 feet. This was probably an even bigger game changer. In nearly an instant, the FCC changed the calculus of satellite distributed programming for cable providers. Suddenly, instead of needing to spend $100,000 on a 30-foot dish that took up their entire parking lot, cable operators could buy a 15-foot dish for just $10,000, and that dish fit on their office roof. With smaller, cheaper satellite dishes, cable systems across the country were now more incentivized than ever to join the satellite revolution. $10,000 is a big difference from $100,000, especially when you're trying to grow and improve the offerings to your subscribers, right? And let's be honest, the FCC's timing couldn't have been any better. By approving both TED's network and lowering the cost of capturing satellite signals, the FCC lit a fire that ignited cable's explosive growth nationwide. I'm sure you're asking, how so? Well, here's some numbers. In 1976, the FCC approved just 20 receive-only satellite dishes, mostly for cable providers that wanted to offer HBO. That following year, the number quadrupled to 80. By the end of 1978, there were 181 dishes nationwide, with more than 200 applications waiting for FCC approval. By the end of 1979, over 1,900 ground receiving stations were live, fueling new stations like Showtime, USA, and Nickelodeon, all following Jerry Levin and Ted Turner's lead. This combination of cable and satellite is really a classic example of 1 + 1 equaling 5. It gave cable systems more programming that was differentiated and new economies of scale that would eventually shatter the big three networks' decades-old dominance. And with minimal government interference, for now, cable became the perfect playground for fast-moving, risk-taking entrepreneurs like Ted Turner. Now, at this point in the mid to late 1970s, Ted had more enemies than ever, all with bigger pockets and more influence and power than him. But that never stopped him before, right? Why would it stop him now? This is a guy who wanted to lead, follow, or get out of the way. You see, when people called Ted's ideas crazy, he saw opportunity. It's a trademark with a lot of the greatest entrepreneurs. He figured, might as well try it, then prove them wrong. The bigger the bet, the more likely Ted was to take it, which was exactly what the cable industry needed in its early satellite days. People who were willing to put it all on the line for their dream. They needed someone with a competitive edge and gusto, someone who thrived on defying the odds and was unafraid to bet it all. Even more so, they needed someone who wouldn't shy away from taking on the dominant networks, not just in New York City, but also in Washington, D.C. But as cable really began to grow, the cable industry started to realize that their biggest challenge wasn't market demand, capital, or technology. No, it was the United States government. On the next episode of Media Moguls, I'll take you into the first few years of Ted's SUPERSTATION as he took the nation by storm, all courtesy of his bet on the satellite. We'll have legendary battles against incumbents, sports leagues, and of course, the government. I'm Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga.